As white women, we need to use our privilege to make positive changes. If you find yourself talking over or speaking for BIPOC individuals, or God forbid, correcting them, just take a beat. And instead, we can put our listening ears on.
That was a TikTok influencer named Ariel Foder, who was speaking on the so-called White Woman for Kamala Zoom call. You probably heard about it because the mainstream media was fawning over it. It was the biggest Zoom call ever in history, they told us. 200,000 white women turning out for a black woman presidential candidate. $8 million raised for Kamala Harris. But wait, you might be thinking, are they missing the point here of what we just heard? Isn't it racist to tell white women to put on their listening ears and check their white privilege? Isn't it kind of racist to have a whites-only event in the first place? Isn't it racist to tell certain people who have a certain color skin, in this case white women, that they're not allowed to interrupt another person because the other person has a different skin color? The answer to that obviously is yes. It's disgusting. It's racist. And the Democrats are openly fomenting racial divide in our country in a way that will lead to significant racially motivated violence unless it is stopped. It's a topic, by the way, that even most conservatives shy away from because the communist left has most Republicans sufficiently cowed. But one of the most severe, even existential threats facing our country today is racial hatred, discrimination against white people. So we're going to dig into this today. Also, you don't want to miss the craziest TikToks of the week. TikTok, by the way, it's shaping, it's forming, it's warping the minds of an entire generation of young people. And I get it. Lots of conservatives just want to ignore it. We don't want our minds poisoned, do we? But if we don't jump in here and compete for the minds of these young people, in a couple years, these newly indoctrinated communists and anti-American zealots will be running our country. Welcome, everybody, to The Liz Wheeler Show. It's a new season of The Liz Wheeler Show. What this show won't be: boring, old, ineffectual commentary. Go tune into Fox if you want the generic political yammering that got us into this mess. Small assumptions allow big lies. So The Liz Wheeler Show will challenge everything. On this show, it's be based or our country dies. What does it mean to be based? Stay tuned. What does it mean to be based? It means basing your worldview in reality. Because we believe in spiritual warfare, we begin the show with a prayer. St. Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all the evil spirits who prowl through the world seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. Remember, there's spiritual warfare around us all the time. We are part of it, whether we acknowledge it or not. So it is time we acknowledge it as we fight the absolute evil that is trying to take hold of our country. Today's show, my friends, is powered by First Cup Coffee. I'm so thankful for this sponsor. I'm so proud to have a sponsor that is based enough and brave enough to advertise on this show. My husband loves this coffee. His favorite blend is called the Boston Common. I highly recommend you give it a try. It's a medium dark roast. You can go to firstcup.com and use my promo code Liz and save an additional 10% on your order. And if you subscribe, you can save an additional 10% for the life of your subscription. Any company brave enough to stand next to us deserves our support. So go ahead and snag your bag. Go to firstcup.com, use my promo code Liz, and you can save an additional 10%. Okay, here's the story of the day and the based take on it. When you hear the phrase racial segregation, what do you think of? When you hear the phrase racial discrimination or racial superiority or racial inferiority, what do you think of? When you hear the phrase race riots or racially motivated violence, what do you think of? You may think of the past, the sin of slavery or Jim Crow laws in our country, discrimination against black people. But that's not what I'm talking about today. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that even most conservatives are still afraid to discuss. In fact, most Republicans are sufficiently cowed by the idea of being branded as politically incorrect, or God forbid the left calls you a racist, that they won't even acknowledge that we are on the verge of a race war in our country. I want you to meet a woman named Ariel Foder, who's a TikTok influencer, who calls herself a gentle parenting expert. That's a topic we'll discuss on a different day. Who was also a lead speaker on the White Woman for Kamala Zoom call. In the following excerpt that I'm going to show you of her lecture at this event, which was for white women only. Isn't it crazy that Democrats are allowed to host whites-only spaces? And it's totally fine and not racist, but when Republicans want voter ID, which black people also want, Republicans are branded as racist. On this Zoom call, a humongous campaign event for Kamala Harris, this TikTok influencer, Ariel Fodor, tells white women, specifically because they're white, to put on their listening ears, to listen to BIPOC people, which is an acronym that means Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, to check their white privilege and under no uncertain terms, do not, as a white woman, ever interrupt a Black woman. Take a listen to this.
Ariel Fodor, affectionately known as Mrs. Frazzle to her combined audience of over 1.5 million followers, is here to help gentle parent us through this election.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I am so honored to speak today. I am like shaking to just be among such incredible company. We are here because, as if you were here earlier, you've heard BIPOC women have tapped us in as white women to step up, listen, and get involved this election season. This is a really important time, and we all need to use our voices and influence for the greater good. No matter who you are all influencers in some way. So tonight, I'm going to share some do's and don'ts for getting involved in politics online and navigating the toxicity that comes with it. And spoiler alert, as much as the toxicity can come from the outside, it can come from us too. So first, don't isolate yourself. We can do our best work when we're in community together like we are tonight, because the toxic feels smaller when we support each other. But don't make it about yourself. As white women, we need to use our privilege to make positive changes. If you find yourself talking over or speaking for BIPOC individuals, or God forbid, correcting them, just take a beat. And instead, we can put our listening ears on. So do learn from and amplify the voices of those who have been historically marginalized, and use the privilege you have in order to push for systemic change. As white people, we have a lot to learn and unlearn. So do check your blind spots. You are responsible for your algorithm, believe it or not.
Okay, so what we're seeing happen before our very eyes is not just an annoying video, although it is. It's not an isolated incident. Kamala Harris or her supporters are openly segregating her campaign events by race. First, there was a Black woman event. It was called Black Women Can Win, and Blacks only invited. Then there was this white woman Zoom called Whites Only Invited. Then there was a white dudes event. You guessed it, no women allowed, no Blacks allowed. Now, if this seems really messed up, really disordered, if this seems openly racially discriminatory, just downright racist, that's because it is. The amount of race baiting, race hatred, racial segregation, and racial discrimination being sponsored, fomented by the Democrats and the left is a deliberate strategy to lead our nation into racial violence. Why? Well, because that's how the left takes over control of our country and of us. Think of the 2020 George Floyd riots. We all remember videos and images of mobs of people marching through the street, demanding that restaurant goers and passerby raise their fists in solidarity. Take a look at this.
No justice! No peace! If we don't get it, shut it down! If we don't get it, shut it down! It's violent! It's violent! It's violent! It's violent! It's violent! It's violent!
I still have mad respect, by the way, for that woman who stared down a communist mob and did not cave. Like, we should all strive to be like that woman. But no logic and no policy, certainly no love for their fellow man or for our country from these protesters. Just a visceral, either you're with us or you're against us. And if you're against us, we'll label you as the enemy. This is their mentality. These leftist-funded protesters didn't actually care about George Floyd, the black man. If they did care, they would have been marching to reject the Democrat policies that destroy the black family, that lead young black men to crime, to violence, to prison, to drugs. But no. These racial rioters and their sponsors, whether it's the progressive donors who paid for it or the Democrat politicians who praised it and allowed it, cared only about wielding George Floyd's death for political power and scaring every American into voting for the left or risking being branded a racist who deserves to have such a mob sicked on you. The left has something the right often lacks: a killer instinct. There is nothing too low, nothing too despicable, nothing too evil for the left if it begets power for them. They're perfectly willing to engage in racial discrimination, to foment racial hatred, to spark racial violence if the result is power for them. The left only cares about power. Anything they say is said with the intent of maintaining or increasing their own political power. And woe to the people who dissent. You will face the most disgusting smears imaginable. You will be accused of dehumanizing other people, and if that doesn't work, you will be dehumanized yourself, especially if you're a black person or a Jew. If you dissent from the left's communist ideology, you'll be rejected as the person that you were created by God to be. You'll be told that you aren't allowed to be black or Jewish if you think for yourself. If, God forbid, you're conservative. You'll be demeaned and insulted and told that you are, quote, white adjacent, which in the eyes of the racist left is the worst of all the things to be, the dreaded white man who deserves, according to the left, all the humiliation, all the subjugation that you'll face if you're a non-white person who is conservative. I'm going to provide you with a concrete example of this. MSNBC host Joy Reid, inflaming, as she always does, racial tension in our nation just a couple of weeks ago, speaking about black Americans who dare to support Republicans. Take a listen to this.
The Orbanism of the party it's rooted in returning white Christian men, but also white men and white adjacent men,
Right.
black men, brown
Right.
men who are like white adjacent in terms of trying to also be in that dominant position in society.
Of all the disgusting, racist ideology, remember, if you are white adjacent in the eyes of the left, then you can be ridiculed. You can be dehumanized. And any person who rejects the left's communist ideology, if they don't already have white skin, is immediately labeled white adjacent. For example, Dr. Ben Carson. What does the left call him? An Uncle Tom. Justice Clarence Thomas. What does the left call him? He's mocked for being married to a white woman. He's called a race traitor. Again, if this sounds disgusting, if it sounds racist, it's because it is. It's pure racial animosity, which is evil in itself, and it's also a tool for political gain for the left. Today in the United States of America, this evil racial hatred is aimed at white people, particularly at white men. Of course, the left's hatred of white people and use of racial strife is nothing new. It's a political strategy intended to foment racial hatred, to lead to racial segregation, to beget racial violence, race riots, even race wars, in order for the left to use the anarchy and violence to impose communism on us all. In 1999, David Horowitz, a former communist radical, released a book titled Hating Whitey and Other Progressive Causes, in which he warned that the left's hatred of white people and animosity towards minorities who think differently than the left was forcing its way into the American public and would be used as a vehicle to implement communism under the code of, quote unquote, level playing field. The call to level the playing field, pushed to its logical conclusion, Horowitz wrote, is a call for the systematic subversion of American individualism and democracy. It is the kitsch Marxism of our time. Republicans, remember, did nothing to stop the venom from seeping out into America. Discussing anti-white racism was taboo, and now, 25 years later, the Democratic Party's presumptive nominee is running her campaign and her allies in the media and political world based on that exact premise, and encouraging discrimination against white people and white adjacent individuals in every aspect of our society. One of the most severe, even existential threats facing our country today, make no mistake, is racial hatred. And this racial hatred and discrimination is aimed at white people. We have a very interesting guest about to join us on the show here in just a moment. But first, I want to talk to you about our sponsor, American Hartford Gold. In all the time that we have been alive, the US dollar has always been the primary currency. But that may not be the case much longer. The US dollar is facing unprecedented inflation, and our politics is getting increasingly unstable. And as if that wasn't scary enough, the government is looking to take total control over all your money with a new digital dollar. That's why it's never been more important to take control over your own wealth. Don't let your life savings become a casualty of failing banks or currency wars. Now is the time to call the only precious metal dealer I trust, American Hartford Gold. They'll show you how to protect your savings, your retirement accounts by diversifying your wealth portfolio with physical gold and silver. With the finest products, amazing customer service, and a buyback commitment, American Hartford Gold has a 5-star rating from thousands of reviews and an A+ rating from the Better Business Bureau. American Hartford Gold supports content like this that's committed to bringing you the truth. Support them. Tell them that I sent you. They'll give you up to $15,000 of free silver on your first order if you call them now. You can click the link in the description of this episode, or you can call 866 866-996-5172. That's 866-996-5172. Or you can text Liz to 998-899. Again, the phone number to call is 866-996-5172. Or text Liz to 998-899. With me now is a man who's made it his mission to study this very issue, and it's not an easy issue to study, as the monologue that we just went through plainly shows you. He wrote a book called The Unprotected Class: How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart. His name is Jeremy Carl. Jeremy, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be with you, Liz.
Jeremy, I think you're a very interesting person. I want to give our listeners and our viewers just a little snippet of your background, not because resume tells the whole story, but just because this is a really touchy topic that we're going to be discussing. And I want people to understand the depth of the research that you have put into this topic, because it's very impressive. So you're a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute. You focus on multiculturalism, nationalism, race relations, and immigration. You're a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Interior of the United States and a research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Again, very impressive resume. I guess before we get into all of the stuff that all the heavy stuff that we just discussed in the monologue, how did you get into this topic? And I mean, you can be as personal or professional here as possible. I'm just saying, a lot of people really shy away from talking about this, especially white people. So as a white man, how did you get into this area of study? What gave you that sort of cue that said, hey, this is a really serious and important topic in our country?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's sort of, this is a variation of like, why would you be such an idiot to like kind of write about something that's so controversial?
I was trying to be diplomatic, right? Jeremy.
This is the polite way, right? And I appreciate that. I mean, I think you really hit on it though. It's because it's such an important topic and people are scared to talk about it. And even more, white people are scared to talk about it. And there's a tendency when we do this to kind of say, well, we're going to have this minority spokesperson make the argument for us. And in fact, when I started doing this, and this was before she was quite so controversial, I would tell people about the book and they'd be like, that's great. Candace Owens should do that book. And I'm like, no, actually, I mean, it's great if she does the book. I'm not complaining, but I think it's really important for white people to be able to speak for themselves. And as far as the personal bio, I actually really began thinking seriously about these issues first about 20 years ago when I was living in India as a newlywed with my wife. She's also American, but we were just there for my work. And I was watching kind of the caste politics there and some of the religious politics and realizing, this really just kind of maps on to a lot of the ethnic politics we have in America. And it was at that time that I read the book Affirmative Action Around the World, an empirical study by Thomas Sowell. And that kind of got me thinking a little bit more seriously about this book. And then it was sort of a long process, but a function of living in California at the time, although I now live in Montana, but I was there at Hoover, and you're confronted with a lot of the extreme racial politics in that state. And it just kind of got to the point that I was like, wow, this is a really big issue. And if we don't talk about it, we're going to be in big trouble.
Why is it, do you think, that so many white people and we're going to get into more detail about how white people face discrimination, segregation, and legal discrimination, not just cultural discrimination, but legal targeting. Why do you think that so many white people are afraid to talk about it when it's just an objective reality that white people are being targeted in our country?
Yeah, well, I think the left does a really good job of canceling people, and they hold the institutional power. This is one of the reasons why Elon buying Twitter was so important, because it gave us at least an outlet where we could speak and not, and say things that weren't necessarily what the left's narrative wanted to be. And even if they screamed, they weren't in a necessary position where they could literally shut down our voices. But I mean, the left does control the commanding heights of culture, and they're able to shut down that discussion because it threatens their power, because all of their power, or not all of it, but a tremendous amount of it, is about ultimately mobilizing various groups kind of to be against whites. And by the way, that includes a kind of very influential white leftist group, which I talk about in the book.
Yeah, and I wonder too, not to wax too philosophically here, but I wonder too if there's a human nature aspect to it, because it is this very gut-wrenching, viscerally bad feeling when someone calls you a racist. And it should be, because you shouldn't be a racist. But obviously the left has weaponized that term. They use it against people who aren't
Yeah.
actually racist. And I wonder if there's a human nature element of that too, but that white people maybe need to be better educated about our nation's past so that they don't trip up over the false accusations of racism that the left is hurling at us just to try to squelch conservative policies, and instead
Right.
can identify and fight against the real racism. And I want to read you a quote that you wrote. I know it's the most uncomfortable thing a host can do to you is to read a quote to yourself, or maybe the second most uncomfortable, actually. The first most uncomfortable is paraphrasing you incorrectly. So I will read you exactly what you said. You said, a big part of your book's central premise is that America is, quote, the most politically salient and socially salient forms of racism today in America are racism against white people. And then you say, launched with an appeal to justice for all, the civil rights movement went off the rails even as it achieved its original goals. Can you expound on those statements? Because in a sense, they're just very academic sounding statements. But if you would say that
Right.
to, you know, some of these Kamala Harris supporters that are playing identity politics that are verging just on outright segregation, I mean, this is going to be like a
Right.
cardinal sin to them.
Well, it's not just verging. I mean, right? They're literally doing the like white dudes for Kamala, white women for Kamala, and there was even a kind of lefty journalist who kind of got on one of those calls and said, you know, hey, you shouldn't be doing this in a racially segregated way, and they kicked him off. So, you know, I think this is very real and not abstract. But yeah, in terms of the specific quotes that you're referring to, yeah, I was essentially saying that there was I mean, he's used too much as a cliche, but Martin Luther King did talk about the content of people's character ultimately being the thing that we want to concentrate on rather than the color of skin. And we kind of reached a point, even in my childhood, I'm a little bit older than you, so I grew up in the 1980s, and we were kind of maybe at a pretty happy medium at that point where we were really trying to get in the 80s and 90s by some of those things. Certainly things were not perfect, but we kind of aspirationally were at least kind of heading in the right direction. I sort of, you know, I say when I grew up, Michael Jordan was the biggest athlete. Eddie Murphy was kind of the most popular actor. Michael Jackson was probably the most famous musician. And we've kind of moved away from that now to a level of racial bean counting and a level of just actually punishing people for being white, both formally and informally.
So let's talk examples here, because I gave some examples in the monologue, but I want to hear a little bit more in depth from you about the institutional and legal discrimination, because we can all think of like the cultural stuff. You talked about cancellation.
Yeah.
I talked about human nature, you know, these leftists trying to shame white people in just to be ashamed of being white because you were born with certain color skin. That's the
Right.
cultural stuff, but it's ratcheted up, right? It's escalating in our country to the point where there are actual institutional and legal discriminatory forms that are being aimed at white people. Can you give us some examples of those?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the most obvious are things like affirmative action and disparate impact and various jobs that are literally being advertised as kind of like, they don't usually say, they're not quite dumb enough to say like no whites, but they'll be like, this is a job targeted for minorities, essentially, which is functionally the same thing as saying no whites. And so you're seeing that increasingly. And in fact, it really is the very rare example in politics and law of the $20 bill just being lying on the ground. And my friends at America First Legal, which is Stephen Miller's outfit, are beginning to successfully sue some of these guys because they're like, you know, actually you can't do that. You can't, you know, have a job that is white people are not eligible for. You can't. But we have these unfortunately things, and one of the things I talk about in the book and sort of open up with is this notion of kind of how the way that we constructed civil rights law kind of over time ultimately led to these things where institutions feel like they have to discriminate against white people, or they can, or again, you see all these programs and they're often advertised in plain sight as like, we're investing, $400 million in minority communities. Well, that, really means we're spending $400 million in something that like white people are not eligible for, or even something trivial. Just last week, I went on TripAdvisor and I can like select for a Black owned or Hispanic owned or Asian owned hotel if I want. But, the idea that I would like be able to pick a white owned hotel is absurd. Right. But they have these things and they're really just out there in plain sight waiting for us to kind of say something about it.
and people won't because of what we just discussed before. So when you say the way that civil rights law was constructed either led to this or allowed to this institutional discrimination against white people, what part of civil rights law, how was it constructed poorly?
Yeah, well, I mean, and I'm actually a little bit less likely. There's a couple other people who've written books recently more narrowly constructed around civil rights law. And it's not that I think that that's necessarily mistaken, but I think it's a much bigger picture. And that's what I try to talk about, that bigger picture in my book, because I think if we eliminated all of these laws today, we would still have a number of these problems because they've burrowed in the culture. But that having been said, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, we were in a situation in which there was actual discrimination that people were trying to remedy, but the problem became that when the way that we did it, the way that we constructed these laws kind of ultimately was going to lead to reverse discrimination over time. It was going to lead to a loss of freedom of association, even in the private sphere. And I think that's what's really key, that it wasn't just that government should never make any distinctions, which I think is something that in general is probably a good idea, but that private organizations no longer had the freedom to say, I'm going to associate with this person and not that person without opening themselves up to potentially very expensive lawsuits. But I think if I had to point to one thing that I would say most radically changed thing, it would be the doctrine of disparate impact, which was introduced in a Supreme Court case called Griggs versus Duke Power in 1971. And it's very interesting because if you go back and read the original debate of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, it's really clear that they would have never, ever countenanced a decision like this. In fact, they were trying to avoid it. But what Griggs basically says is if you have an employment process, for example, and you wind up with a racial profile at the end of that process that is kind of different than the process of the population you're drawing from or the kind of demographics, you're potentially open to a lawsuit for having a disparate impact against that group. And there are various ways that you can show that, okay, well, I had to do it and that's why it was like this. But functionally what this does is it just causes businesses to discriminate against white people in hiring so that they don't open themselves to these types of lawsuits. So we had disparate impact. We had a bunch of things that built on top of that. And I think that's kind of the legacy that we're dealing with today.
So let me give a hypothetical to make sure that I understand the disparate impact. So for example, if you were a hospital system and you were hiring 10 doctors and the community that you lived in was, I don't know, say it was like 48% black, 48% white, and 2% Asian, right, and then 2% Indian, and you then hired mostly Asian and Indian doctors because they were the ones who happened to be more likely to go to medical school, you could be liable under this law, or you could somehow be found criminal under this law because you didn't have enough. I mean, nobody would ever prosecute it from a white person standpoint, but because you didn't have enough black people, even though they comprised almost half of the population of that area?
Correct. And that's the type of situation in which you'd wind up vulnerable to these suits. And it's not that the left will always say, and kind of trying to dismiss the very large impact this has, oh, well, there's not a million of these suits. Well, there's not a million of these suits because companies have HR departments that are paying a great deal of attention to this law, which they know is on the books, and they want to make sure that they don't run afoul of it. And so they're sort of massaging the employment numbers up front so that they don't run into problems. And again, there are ways to get around it. I mean, you can show that, like, gosh, this was like the only way that we could hire qualified people was to go to, white guys or whatever. But it's difficult to do, and it puts your company at legal risk. And of course, if you know CEOs, the number one thing they hate is any sort of legal risk. So they just avoid it by discriminating on the front end of their hiring processes.
So how do you get rid of that? Because that seems to me to be more than, it's even a step further than ESG. We talk often on this show about ESG and how woke corporations don't want to be targeted. They don't want to be canceled themselves. And so they buy into these threats, these organizations that come from the United Nations, like the Corporate Equity Index or something like that, comes around and says, hey, Bud Light, if you don't hire Dylan Mulvaney, if you don't promote transgender rights, then we're gonna, transgender rights, quote unquote.
Right.
Then we're gonna publicly humiliate you, and it's gonna negatively impact your business. And so these companies are either coerced into doing this, or they're worried that they're not going to have access to capital if ESG goes as far as ESG
Sure.
is intended to go. But what you're suggesting sounds to me like even a step further than this, that it's not just woke corporations that are sort of acting out of a fear and cowardice, that they could actually be targeted by the law. So how do we undo that if it's a Supreme Court ruling?
Yeah, well, so it's even, it's you're picking up that it's worse even than what you might think. And in fact, I tell this story quite extensively in my book, but basically it's a classic example of Republican cowardice. So what happens, I gave you the executive summary. That's a 1971 case. The Supreme Court in 1989 comes back, and this is very rare that this sort of thing happens, but they realize even the court's still pretty liberal at this point. They're like, wow, we kind of messed up. This is too much. They have a case called Ward's Cove versus Antonio, where they functionally gut the Griggs case. And they basically make it much, much harder to have a disparate impact suits. So what happens? The civil rights groups freak out, and the George H.W. Bush administration at the time caves completely, even though all the politicals, you can read that they have accounts of this, in the Civil Rights Division knew just how bad this was. They didn't have the courage to stand up for what they believed in. And so we sign a civil rights law in 1991 that actually codifies Griggs within the law beyond the Supreme Court case. So it's even worse than that. And it's also just an example of how cowardly we've been as a party on these issues. I think our best hope is that we can actually get a Griggs-type case, as we just did with this affirmative action case where we won at the Supreme Court, in front of the Supreme Court, and they can basically say, you know what, this type of disparate impact thing that the doctrine is just unconstitutional. That's really our best bet at this point, but we need the right plaintiff and we need the right attorneys, and there are people in the conservative legal movement who spend their time thinking about this, and I can only hope that they're kind of moving a case like this forward.
Well, I always find it, to be honest, a little discouraging, I guess, when the recourse is, oh, we have to have the perfect case for the Supreme Court, because then you get it in front of the Supreme Court, and even if it's the perfect case, or you think it is, there can be some minor little technicality, and they just kick it to the curb because they don't want to hear it. I prefer legislative and executive action. I know that that's not always possible, but you mentioned our party being cowardly, and this is the problem, though. This is the problem that I've always had with affirmative action, is Republicans have bought into this. Republicans, in fact, one of the most common talking points you'll hear from Republicans is, oh, you know, it's gone off the rails a little bit. It's become a little bit woke, but it was necessary at the time. It's something I absolutely supported when it began, because we just had to do it, and so it was a good thing, and now it's a bad thing. And I'm like, okay, but at what point? Like, it's like the abortion arguments where they're like, abortion's okay in the first trimester, but not in the second. And I was like, at what point, besides the moment of conception, does that baby become a human being? Like, who are you to arbitrarily label this, invent this moment that all of a sudden this person has rights or doesn't? That's the same thing to me with affirmative action. How can Republicans say it was necessary at the time, it was a good thing, but now it's not, now it's been harnessed for woke? Like, untangle that a little bit for me. Tell me if I'm wrong, because I think it's been bad the whole time.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting thing, and I try to do this in kind of trying to write a very provocative book. I'm trying not to be more provocative than necessary. They talk about,
I respect that, by the way. That's why I invited you on the show, because it is like it is a topic that's handled oftentimes in a bombastic way, and I'm trying not to do that. I'm trying to just have a conversation that sometimes people might say, wow, saying that is uncomfortable, but as long as it's the truth that's uncomfortable and not the presentation, we're good here. So go ahead.
Absolutely. So I think I was a history major, and I think it was Gordon Wood who said, a really great American historian, who said kind of the purpose of the historian is to restore the full sort of set of possibilities to a historical actor that existed at that time. And that's kind of a way of just saying, like, the people who were looking at this when these laws came about in the 1960s, again, we really did have, particularly in unions, you had kind of overt racial discrimination that was going on that was really not okay. And so they were trying to address this in the best way that they can. And I think it's totally reasonable to say, by the way, that it was just wrong from the beginning, but at least I think it was understandable at the beginning. But it quickly has kind of metastasized into a place where more qualified white people are being passed over for people in other categories, right? And so I just think we're long past a point, you know, I don't need to kind of have the big historical debate with people other than to say, look, we're long past the point where this is just unconscionable reverse discrimination and we need to get rid of it. And I'm just kind of looking forward in that way.
Well, this is the reason that I said at the beginning that I think you're an interesting person, because you are extremely gracious in talking about this topic, which is necessary because it can be an uncomfortable topic. But I think the lesson that I draw when I look back at the history, and again, I'm not trying to be bombastic here. We all look at the 1960s. Something did have to be done. And again, I don't want to sound like the gun control activists that are like, anything is better than nothing. Something had to be done. But it's a lesson to us now as we look at policy in our country and what the recourse or the response should be to this anti-white discrimination, to make sure that whatever we do, that we are looking at the long-term consequences and not just the short-term benefits. Because what can be abused by the government will be abused. People that can be in vulnerable positions will be exploited by politicians. And I guess that's where my main criticism lies of the inception of affirmative action. Is it seems to me, and again, I wasn't there, so be that as it may, but it seems to me that you could have with a little forethought been like, well, there's a pretty big vulnerability for that to be abused. All that being said, though, I do want to hear your response to what Kamala Harris has been doing, because there's just no question about it that she's been engaging in not only racially charged language, but I mean, it's racial segregation, is it not? When she's hosting whites-only spaces and blacks-only spaces and having speakers on the white women call that are telling white women under no circumstance is it acceptable or permitted for you to interrupt a black person. I mean, is that not racism?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's kind of amazing to see. And I'm really glad, not to sound like a Marxist, but Marx talks about heightening the contradictions, right? And I think this is really great. The thing I hated many things about Joe Biden, but one of the things that I hated about Joe Biden was that he was, at least to the kind of, moderate person in the Midwest, say he's not paying a lot of attention to politics. He was the kindly white face on this anti-white discrimination regime. And I think Kamala just pulls that back, not just because she's obviously not like the white granddad, but because she's like a liberal leftist San Francisco Democrat who puts the radical politics right up front, who puts the anti-white discrimination, the whites only calls, the blacks only things right up front, and says, what vision ultimately of America do we want? Do we want that vision, or do we want a vision where we have equal rights for everybody and we're all aspiring together as Americans? And so I want us to be able to make that choice. And I think Kamala Harris, because she can't help herself and she also can't run from her record, is making that choice much more clear. And even though I kind of lament as an American that we have any nominee for a major party saying stuff like this, it's a good thing that at least the choice should be really clear to Americans in terms of what we should want. Yeah,
I think that's correct. In terms of what's going to happen, I think that a lot of people in our country, and this is not even different racial demographics, this is more if you've gone through the public school system, if your kids have been on TikTok, if you've been immersed at all in pop culture, anybody essentially who hasn't deliberately been countercultural is somewhat vulnerable, I think, to falling for these narratives. And so my question to you is, there's a lot of work that's being done to reverse the indoctrination in schools, to live counterculturally, to provide alternatives to entertainment, especially Hollywood-type entertainment TV shows, so that the next generation might not be quite as brainwashed in Marxist ideology as they seem to be at the moment. But in the next 3.5 months until the election, all of this stuff, you and I can sit here and say, wait a second, equity is not equality. Diversity, when the left says it, they're not talking about diversity of thought or opinion or experience. They're talking about quota racial or token racial quotas. Inclusion is essentially discrimination as well, sometimes outright persecution. Are people in a position where they can see reality here, or are they so brainwashed that this identity politics that Kamala Harris is playing will work?
Right. Well, I guess we're going to see it in a few months. I'm actually still pretty optimistic. I think the media is trying to meme Kamala into office, but I think that at a level of a presidential race, it's a little harder to kind of completely pull the wool over the eyes of the American people. They're going to really have a chance to look at her up close, to look at her record up close in a way that they didn't even when she was just running for VP, because it's not the same, right? And I am confident they're not going to see like what they see there. I've been pleased that the Trump campaign has not been shy about going after Kamala's radicalism. They're putting stuff like her response to the Black Lives Matter movement, which was outrageous, where she's trying to raise money for a bail fund to bail criminals out of jail. They're looking at some of the very radical things she's done on immigration policy, and of course her complete absence and dereliction of duty as the quote unquote border czar. They're putting these things up front. They're not trying to kind of get cute and attack, do this like Kamala the cop or attack her from the left, which I think would be a huge mistake. So we're not going to completely re-educate the American people over the next 3 months. But I think the good news for us is that I don't think, as much power as the media has, at the end of the day, Kamala and her record are going to be out there. And I don't think that she can fully run from them. And that's why I'm optimistic. I mean, I told people, there is more variance. I think it's certainly very possible that she could do better than Biden. But I think what the Democrats haven't totally accounted for is the fact that when people really get a close look at her, she could actually do much worse than Biden, because she really is a much more radical and polarizing figure without kind of the retail political skills that Biden, when he was not senile at least, had.
My personal opinion on a nickname for Kamala, and I've recommended this to the Trump campaign, is Kamala the Commie. I think that's the best.
Yeah.
That's the best of them all, because except for the AOCs and the Bernie Sanders and maybe Trans Tifa, who really are still fringe. I mean, we have the Hamas sympathizers in the streets, but they're not the majority of our country, at least not yet. Most people don't want a communist, and it will just bring to mind exactly what you're talking about: her support of Black Lives Matter, wanting to bail criminals out of jail, the open border, all of her insane use of government targeting journalists because the journalists happen to expose a crime committed by Planned Parenthood, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. It's a very interesting time. And this question, and I really want to frame this question carefully, because in the lead up to the attempted assassination of President Trump, there were a lot of us who were warning that the rhetoric coming from the mainstream media and the left, calling Trump Hitler, calling him a dictator, calling him authoritarian, pretending, lying, saying that he was going to commit a genocide against LGBTQIA people, like all that kind of stuff. We were like, hey, this rhetoric's going to lead to something. It's going to make people so fearful for their lives that some crazy is going to act out. And especially when you add DEI into, the Secret Service, for example, DEI just breeds chaos, which breeds violence. Yeah. This is not going to end well. And I think that the left intended that. I don't think it was an accident. And so my question to you is sort of the same scenario, but applied to the racial rhetoric against white Americans. Is this leading down the same dangerous road that will eventually not just lead to racial animosity and racial segregation or racial discrimination, all of which is evil and bad, but is this going to lead to, race riots, racial violence, racial war if it's not stopped?
Well, I do have concern about that, and I kind of end my first chapter. I don't quite say it overtly because, again, I don't. It's not that I'm trying to hide the ball, but I don't use terms like race war because it's sort of inflammatory, and I'm really not trying to write an inflammatory book. But I do sort of suggest that, hey, the history of multiracial and multi-ethnic polities is not necessarily the rosiest one. I mean, often they do kind of end up fighting against each other in kind of some pretty brutal and bloody ways. And we have even some history of that, obviously, in America. But you should be very concerned about this dehumanizing rhetoric, the anti-white rhetoric. Now, I don't think on a number of interviews have kind of asked me, like, will the U.S. turn into South Africa? Well, no. I mean, I think that's the short answer, because we just have a very different demographic situation here. Whites are not in any danger of becoming like a 7% minority or whatever they are in South Africa. We have a different history. But what you see, and again, I document a lot of this in my book, is that whites are overwhelmingly the victims, not the perpetrators of interracial crimes, and that many of those crimes, and particularly sexually related crimes, have an explicitly or implicitly racial valence to them, unfortunately. And the media doesn't like to talk about that, but it's there. I mean, I think something like 98% of interracial rape murders are black on white rather than the reverse, right? So you do have some of these things that are underneath the surface, and the media really doesn't want to have that type of conversation because it asks and raises some very uncomfortable questions for them. But I do think it's a conversation we need to have, and it's a concern over the long term, for sure.
Man, one of the things I respect the most in politics is just, and it's out of fashion for sure in an era of clickbait and bombast, is just sticking to the facts and using logic and data to back up your opinions. I really respect that about you, Jeremy, and especially as it relates to this topic. Guys, I cannot highly recommend his book, An Unaffected Class, How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart. Jeremy Carl, thank you for being on the show. I appreciate it. All right, guys, let's watch some TikToks. You guys know that I think that TikTok should be banned, right? I do. I think TikTok should be banned. I think it's a poison on the mind of the American youth, and I think that it is a national security risk because it is literally run by a company controlled by the Chinese Communist Party who is using transgender ideology, anti-American ideology, Marxist ideology in order to subvert our nation from within. It obviously should be banned. I know that this is controversial even among conservatives because there are some conservatives who pretend it's a free speech issue, which it's not. There are other conservatives or Republicans who have a financial interest in TikTok. I don't care about any of that. I think it should be banned. The one caveat to that is just because I think it should be banned doesn't mean that I think we should ignore it. I don't think conservatives and Republicans should ignore it. I think, in fact, that if we don't take part in TikTok, if we don't compete with the content that is so pervasive on TikTok, then we're basically just writing off all of these young people who are consuming this content. We're basically saying, well, because we don't want to wade into this messy area, because we don't think that this messy area should exist, then they're just going to have, the other side's going to have a monopoly on all that content. So I won't continue to rant about this, but we will, well, I probably will. I probably will continue to rant about this, but let's watch some TikToks and respond to them so that young people at least have two different opinions to decide between, a good one and a bad one. Okay, we're ready. Okay, that's Dylan Mulvaney. You know who Dylan Mulvaney is? The transgender who caused us all to boycott Bud Light when Bud Light sponsored Dylan Mulvaney. Here's what I will say. Dylan Mulvaney, this is actually like a very weird mind-trippy thing. So a man pretending to be a woman, pretending to be a man. That's what we just saw, but he's more believable in that outfit than he is in a dress. That's what I will say. Next.
Being child-free threatens the patriarchy. We don't need no man. We can do everything he can.
Busted!
I'm a bold lip. Taylor's on my side. I'm a bold lip. MAGA starts to cry. What? I'm a bold lip.
You know, I actually saw that going viral on X yesterday, and there were a lot of comments under it about how sad and pathetic this woman is. I think she's in her 40s, and how she's trying to be a Taylor Swift fangirl, or she is a Taylor Swift fangirl in her 40s, and how that's pathetic. And while I don't necessarily disagree with that, that wasn't the first. That was not my first reaction. My first reaction was that it's really sad that she thinks that to make a political statement, she has to deprive herself of truly the joy of life. And I can say this because I have children. I had my first child at age 31. I have 2 daughters now, and I can give you a direct comparison of what it is like to be without children in a professional career and to be with children growing your family. And there's absolutely nothing that can possibly compare to it. It is not. You do not have to stick it to the patriarchy by not having a family. Children, not to sound preachy, but children are such a gift from God. Nothing will ever bring you more joy than having a child. Yeah, it's hard. Yeah, you have to sacrifice some time, and it's 100% worth it. I hope young people don't fall for this because I don't know, when I was growing up, when I was in high school, even before high school, when I was a little girl in high school and in college, we were all excited to be moms. That was something that we desired to be, and something, when we were a little girl, I would play house, I would play baby dolls. I was so excited to be a mom, and it's everything that I ever thought that it would be. And as you can plainly see sitting here, it doesn't mean that you are in some way subjugated or that you can't have other pursuits or hobbies or even a job if that's what you feel so called to do. So I don't know, I had a different reaction than I know a lot of people. I don't feel personal animosity towards this woman. I just feel that she is missing something so amazing, something that's beyond this life. She's missing something that has eternity beyond herself. And I hope she sees the light.
I swear, if I could go back in time and tell the woman that stood up for our right to work, I would.
You know, this is actually the thing I like about Gen Z. Gen Z gets a lot of bad raps, but one thing that I've noticed about Gen Z is for the first time, especially young women, in Gen Z aren't buying into this feminist narrative that in order to reach your full potential, in order to be fulfilled, in order to be liberated and empowered, that means you have to reject your femininity. That means you have to want to work in jobs that are usually more suited for men or that men prefer to do. This is what feminists for decades told women, and most women, even if they didn't agree, they kept quiet about it because they thought that they were wrong. And Gen Z for the first time is like, wait a second, I'm not fulfilled working 9 to 5 at a desk in a bank somewhere. I want to create a home for someone. I want to love a husband. I want to raise children. I want to cook and create and educate my children and foster these souls. And I love that about Gen Z. Yeah. All right, next up.
I, Kamala Harris, am your Democrat candidate for president because Joe Biden finally exposed his senility at the debate. Thanks, Joe. I was selected because I am the ultimate diversity hire. I'm both a woman and a person of color. So if you criticize anything I say, you're both sexist and racist. I may not know the first thing about running the country, but remember, that's a good thing if you're a deep state puppet. I had 4 years under the tutelage of the ultimate deep state puppet, a wonderful mentor, Joe Biden.
You know what's really funny about that? Obviously, it's a parody. Elon Musk posted that on X, and because it's AI Kamala Harris, and it cracked me up, absolutely cracked me up when I saw this. But you know who was triggered? This triggered the heck out of Gavin Newsom, the governor of California. He said he was going to pass a law that banned parodies that used AI. And if you really want to laugh, I'm not going to show you on this show, but you should go look at Elon Musk's response to Gavin Newsom, saying that he was going to make the fact that Elon posted this video on X illegal. Elon, it's PG-13, his response, but it's pretty funny. And that ad, by the way, is actually the most accurate ad that we've ever seen about Kamala Harris, right? Yeah, definitely is. Okay, last one.
The only thing that matters is your soul. Do you not understand? There is no exceptions when you're in front of him. There's no arbitration. There's no mediation. The nanosecond you and I die, the nanosecond, before people walk away from your bed, before they leave to get in their cars, you have already been judged, and you're either in heaven, hell, or purgatory. That's it. It's done. And someday you and I are going to stand in front of him naked and alone. And let me promise you, we will hear 1 or 2 words come judgment day. Man, depart from me. Well, Lord, man, I proclaimed you to be the Messiah. I held your money. So did Judas. Or he's going to say, welcome to my table. God, I have waited for you. I bragged on you. I told the saints about you. I said, watch him, watch her, watch. They're going to make the sign of the cross and they're going to be belittled and condemned for it. Amen? Amen. Amen.
Amen. BRB going to confession right now. Kidding, not kidding. That's the end of the show for today. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you for watching. I'm Liz Wheeler. This is The Liz Wheeler Show.